They told you this war would pay for itself. $50 billion? Tops. They said oil revenues would cover the cost. They said American troops would be home by Christmas. They lied. The real bill was $3 trillion. But here's what they didn't tell you. It wasn't just the war that cost $3 trillion. It was how they paid for it that destroyed your economy. You think the 2008 financial crisis happened because of greedy bankers and subprime mortgages? You're half right. But you're missing the bigger picture. The 2008 crisis didn't start on Wall Street. It started in Baghdad. The moment the first missile hit Iraqi soil, a financial time bomb started ticking. And when it exploded 5 years later, millions of Americans lost their homes, their jobs, their savings. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is mathematics. This is cause and effect. This is what happens when you follow the money, and the money tells a very different story than the one you were told. Before the invasion, they brought out their economists. Lawrence Lindsay, Bush's economic advisor, gave the American people a number, $60 billion for the entire war. When people questioned that estimate, they fired him. The Pentagon said $50 billion. Some officials whispered it could go as low as $30 billion. Donald Rumsfeld said the war would last weeks, not months. They were selling you a war with a price tag they knew was fiction. Because here's what really happened. By the time the dust settled, the actual cost wasn't $50 billion. It wasn't even $100 billion. Economists Linda Bilmes and Joseph Stiglitz, a Nobel Prize winner, calculated the true cost, $3 trillion. $3 trillion. That's 60 times more than what they told you, but it gets worse. Because that $3 trillion doesn't just sit in a spreadsheet. It doesn't just disappear into thin air. That money has to come from somewhere. And when a government needs to find $3 trillion it does two things. It borrows and it prints. Both of those actions have consequences. Consequences that don't show up in Baghdad. They show up in your neighborhood. Let's go to the crime scene. Iraq, 2003 to 2011. The Coalition Provisional Authority, the temporary government the U.S. set up, had control of something called the Development Fund for Iraq. This was Iraqi oil money held in trust, meant to rebuild the country. $12 billion in cash was flown into Iraq on military cargo planes, shrink-wrapped pallets of $100 bills. The CPA lost track of $8.8 billion. Gone. Vanished. No receipts, no records. Just gone. Imagine that for a second. $8.8 billion in cash, and nobody knows where it went. One investigation found a contractor who received $2 million to build a police academy. The building was so poorly constructed that human waste dripped from the ceilings. $2 million, sewage dripping from the ceiling. This wasn't incompetence. This was theft on a scale most people can't comprehend. But that missing cash is just the visible part. The real crime is structural. It's what economists call the Cantillon Effect. Here's how it works. When a government spends money, that money doesn't spread evenly through the economy. The people who get it first benefit the most. The people who get it last suffer inflation. War spending is the perfect example. The government borrowed and printed money to fund the war. That money went first to defense contractors, Halliburton, Lockheed Martin, Blackwater, ExxonMobil. Their stock prices soared. Their executives got rich. They were first in line. Meanwhile, regular Americans were last in line. By the time that borrowed money circulated through the economy, it showed up as higher prices, higher gas prices, higher food prices, higher costs for everything. The war wasn't just paid for with taxes. It was paid for by inflating away the value of your paycheck. This is the hidden transfer of wealth, from your wallet to their portfolio. Now let's talk about oil. In 2002, before the invasion, oil was trading at around $25 per barrel. By 2008, it hit $147 per barrel, a 400% increase. You felt this every time you filled your tank. In 2008, gas prices in the U.S. hit $4 per gallon. For many families, this was devastating. Think about what this means for a household budget. If you're spending an extra $200 a month on gas, that's $200 you can't spend on your mortgage. And millions of Americans were already stretched thin because they'd taken out mortgages they could barely afford, believing that housing prices would keep rising forever. But here's the part they don't connect for you. Why did housing prices rise in the first place? Why did people take out those risky loans? Because the Federal Reserve kept interest rates artificially low. And why did the Fed keep rates low? To finance the war, and to prevent the war spending from crashing the economy. Here's the mechanism. When the government borrows trillions to fund a war, it floods the market with treasury bonds. If interest rates rise too high, the government can't afford to pay the interest on that debt. So the Fed stepped in. It kept rates low, artificially low. Low interest rates made borrowing cheap. Mortgages became cheap. Everyone could suddenly afford a house. Demand exploded. Prices soared. Banks started giving out loans to anyone with a pulse. No income verification, no down payment, subprime mortgages. The housing bubble inflated, and when oil prices quadrupled because of the war, when Americans couldn't afford both their mortgage and their gas bill, the defaults started. One default became 10, 10 became 1,000, 1,000 became a million. The bubble popped. Lehman Brothers collapsed. Bear Stearns disappeared. The entire financial system seized up. September 2008, the Great Recession. They told you it was greed. They told you it was bad loans. They didn't tell you it started with a war funded by fake money and low interest rates. Joseph Stiglitz and Linda Bilmes laid this out clearly. The Iraq War was a direct contributor to the 2008 financial crisis. The war drained resources from the domestic economy. It diverted money that could have built infrastructure, funded education, strengthened the safety net. Instead, it was buried in the desert. But the war didn't just cost money while it was happening. Wars have long tails, 40 years long in this case. The U.S. sent over 2 million service members to Iraq and Afghanistan. Hundreds of thousands came home with traumatic brain injuries, PTSD, missing limbs, damaged bodies. The cost of caring for these veterans, providing medical treatment, disability benefits, mental health services, that bill is estimated at $1 trillion. $1 trillion spread over the next 40 years. Every year, the U.S. budget has to carve out tens of billions just to pay for the consequences of a war that officially ended in 2011. This is what Bilmes called the hidden cost. It doesn't show up in the Pentagon's war budget. It shows up in the Veterans Affairs budget. It shows up in healthcare spending. But it's still a war cost, and it's still being paid by you. Let's talk opportunity cost. $3 trillion. What could that money have done? It could have rebuilt every bridge in America. It could have provided free college tuition for a generation. It could have funded a Manhattan Project for renewable energy. Instead, it exploded in the desert. But even that's not the full picture, because $3 trillion wasn't paid in cash. It was borrowed. And borrowed money accrues interest. The U.S. national debt in 2001, before the war, was about $5.7 trillion. Today, it's over $36 trillion. A significant portion of that increase came from war spending and the interest on war spending. Interest that compounds. Year after year, forever. The war may have ended, but the debt never does. Here's what they don't want you to understand. Modern wars aren't funded by taxes anymore. They're funded by debt and inflation. In World War II, the U.S. government raised taxes. It sold war bonds. It asked Americans to sacrifice. In Iraq, they did the opposite. They cut taxes. They told Americans to go shopping. They borrowed the money and let future generations worry about paying it back. This is what economists call fiscal irresponsibility. But that's a polite term. The real term is theft. Theft from the future. Theft from your children. Theft from anyone who holds dollars and watches their value erode year after year. Because every dollar the government borrows and spends dilutes the value of every dollar you hold. That's inflation. And inflation is a hidden tax, a tax you never voted for, a tax that shows up when your grocery bill doubles, when your rent increases, when your paycheck buys less than it did last year. The war in Iraq cost $3 trillion. But the real cost is the purchasing power you lost, the opportunities that vanished, the future that was stolen to pay for a war, sold on lies. That's inflation. So when you hear economists talk about the 2008 financial crisis, and they mention subprime mortgages and credit default swaps and mortgage-backed securities, they're not wrong. But they're starting the story in the middle. The story starts in 2003. It starts with a government that lied about the cost of a war. It starts with a Federal Reserve that printed money to keep the war machine running. It starts with oil prices that quadrupled and strangled household budgets. It starts with $3 trillion that had to come from somewhere. And it came from you, your home equity, your retirement account, your paycheck, your future. The banks didn't create the crisis. They were just the transmission mechanism. The bomb was built in Washington and Baghdad. Wall Street just happened to be standing there when it went off. Here's the verdict. The Iraq War didn't just fail to find weapons of mass destruction. It didn't just fail to bring democracy to the Middle East. It didn't just cost thousands of American lives and hundreds of thousands of Iraqi lives. It bankrupted the American economy. It turned the United States from a productive economy into a debt and war economy. It shifted wealth from the middle class to defense contractors. It inflated a housing bubble that destroyed millions of families. And it saddled future generations with a debt they'll never be able to repay. $3 trillion, 60 times more than they promised. And the bill is still growing. Because that debt accrues interest every single day. The veterans' medical costs continue for decades. The geopolitical instability the war created continues to require military spending. The war never ended. It just moved from the battlefield to your bank account. You were told the 2008 crisis was about Wall Street greed. You were told it was about subprime borrowers who took out loans they couldn't afford. You were told it was a failure of regulation. All of that is true. But it's not the whole truth. The whole truth is that the crisis was born the moment the first Tomahawk missile left a U.S. warship and headed toward Baghdad. Everything that followed, the oil shock, the inflation, the cheap money, the housing bubble, the collapse, was a direct consequence of a war funded by lies and debt. They sold you a $50 billion war. They delivered a $3 trillion disaster. And they never apologized. They never admitted the connection. They let you believe it was your fault, that you borrowed too much, that you were irresponsible. But the math tells a different story. The math says the war created the crisis. The math says you were lied to. The U.S. national debt is now $36 trillion. A large portion of that is war debt. Iraq, Afghanistan. The interest on that debt, and that debt will never be repaid. It will just keep growing, compounding, forever. Because debt is an enemy that never sleeps. You can't negotiate with it. You can't defeat it in battle. It just sits there in the spreadsheet demanding payment every year, every month, every day. And every payment is money that could have gone to schools, hospitals, infrastructure, your future. Instead, it goes to bondholders, to interest payments, to servicing a debt created by a war sold on lies. So the next time someone tells you the 2008 crisis was caused by greedy bankers, you can agree. But add this. The bankers were feeding on a carcass. The war killed the economy. The bankers just picked the bones. The next time someone tells you the economy collapsed because people took out loans they couldn't afford, you can agree. But add this. They took out those loans because the Fed made money cheap to finance a war. And they defaulted because oil prices quadrupled because of that same war. The next time someone tells you that history is complicated, that there are no simple answers, you can agree. But then show them the math. 50 billion promised, 3 trillion delivered, oil at $25, oil at $147, interest rates at 1%, housing bubble, collapse, cause and effect, mathematics, reality. The truth is always in the numbers. You just have to know where to look. The war in Iraq officially ended in 2011. But look at your wallet. Look at your rent, your grocery bill, your gas tank, your paycheck. The war is still happening. It's happening every time you pay taxes that go towards servicing war debt. It's happening every time inflation eats away at your savings. It's happening every time a veteran struggles to get medical care because the system is overwhelmed. The bombs stopped falling in Baghdad, but the economic bombs are still exploding in your life. They told you this war would pay for itself. It didn't. You paid for it, and you're still paying? History doesn't hide the answers. It just buries them under lies and official narratives and complicated jargon. My job is simple. I show you where to dig. The rest is up to you. If this video changed how you see the 2008 crisis, hit the subscribe button. If you want more investigations that follow the money and expose the truth behind the headlines, turn on notifications. And if you think someone else needs to see this, share it. Because the truth doesn't spread itself, the numbers don't lie, but the people in power do. See you in the next investigation.